Hi, folks. Beautiful fall day here. Hold on just a sec. Let me get everything set up. Here we go. All right. Got some announcements first. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And we'll go ahead and do that. Oops, where did I go? Oh boy, that's not good. Shoot, hold on a sec. I messed up again. Hold on, just give me a second, everybody. Sorry. All right, so I'm going to pin to the first screen. There I am. Go back to this. Go back to that. Share my screen. And why? All right, hold on. Okay, give me a second, everybody. I got to sort some stuff out here. There we go. I think this will take care of it. Hopefully, everything is now working okay. Sharing screen, we're recording. Good. And you are seeing information on the final exam, which is coming up quick. It's the summer. Everything happens fast in the summer. So your final exams this coming weekend. But given how well most of you did on the midterm, I'm sure you'll do well on the final too. Let me just get a couple other things set up here. Okay, so same deal as the midterm, exact same situation. You can take it anytime between Friday at 12 a.m. All the way to Sunday at midnight. So you've got that 3-day period to take the exam, and again, it will be a 90-minute exam. You can take it anytime during that 3-day period. It is completely open book, which makes it easier, of course, but it must be taken alone. And we'll have this about the same number of questions. I have to kind of fine tune the exam, but it will be 60 questions more or less. It will cover everything since the last exam. So all the lecture material, actually, all the lecture material since the last exam through Thursday's class, of course. And so that will be everything after taste. So that will include touch and faces and imitation, and then multisensory perception, which will be covered on Thursday. It will also just cover your discussion section material after the smell and taste stuff, so that again is touch and coordination and all that stuff you've been going through, and including tomorrow's. And then the book material since chapter 6, everything, including chapter 6 through the epilogue. There's a little short chapter at the very end. Make sure you go through that as well, just kind of a conclusion chapter. Okay, there'll be a couple of questions on that very last chapter as well. Oh, there is a chat. Let me get this. Okay. Oh, you can't hear anything. Ay, ay, ay. Anyone else having trouble hearing? Ah. Just somebody either, can you hear me? Go ahead and put a thumb up or say you can hear me. What the heck? Are people not able to hear me? Okay, well, so Jumai, you can hear me okay? You're hearing me? Yes. Okay. Anybody, are other people hearing me? Just give me, I just need one more just to make sure that um, yes. Okay. Thanks, Alex. Okay. So I guess, okay. Thanks, Carla. Yeah. Great. Let me just check a couple of things here. Sorry, I do want to make sure because I have been messing around with things lately. Yeah, it seems like I got the right mic input, so, and it looks like it's working here. Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you, Carla. Okay, so yes, everything since the last exam should be very straightforward. Um, Now, the only other thing I wanted to mention, Thursday's lecture, it turns out I'll have to be traveling during this time. So it will be an asynchronous lecture, and I will post a video. I think there'll most likely be videos from previous summer classes recordings. I thought I was going to be able to lecture live on Thursday, but as it turns out, I'll actually still be on the plane. We had to change our flights. I apologize for that. But so I will be traveling. Actually, I'm leaving tomorrow, but I will be available if you need to email me or something. And of course, your TAs will also be available. So we're not meeting this time on Thursday. Instead, you can look at a lecture that will be posted along with the videos that are currently on YouTube. And I will certainly make an announcement on the Canvas site about this as well. I realize there's going to be folks that aren't here right now that won't get this until later. So I will make sure that everybody knows that. So Thursday, we're not meeting at that regular class time, but there will be a recorded lecture available for you to look at. It will cover everything that I would have covered if I were in lecture. Okay. Any questions on the exam format, what it covers, or the situation on Thursday? Okay, anything? Okay, Carla, are you back on? Can you hear me okay? Okay, maybe she's not. Yes, good, good. I'm glad it worked out. Any other issues, questions? Okay, good. So we are going to continue talking about faces today, and then we'll start talking about imitation, which is also in the book as a visual modality sort of function. And then on Thursday, the video will cover multisensory perception and cover probably will also have to cover part of the imitation, but it will cover lip reading as a multisensory function, and then general topics in multisensory perception. Okay, cool. So if there's no questions, then we will continue talking about faces. And let's remember what we were doing with faces. So this is a slide you've seen. And the way we introduce this is through that really cool phenomenon known as the uncanny valley. And what the uncanny valley shows is that when it comes to perceiving faces, if animators aren't getting the faces exactly right, they are very noticeable to us, and they in fact look kind of eerie. They look kind of scary, maybe having to do with our kind of evolutionary cause of trying to stay away from cadavers or things that are, dead bodies in general, faces in particular. That might be why it's eerie, but what it really demonstrates more than anything, I think, is our hypersensitivity to faces, that we are especially attuned to any sort of deviation from what looks like a normal face. And then we continue talking about this topic in the context of being able to being able to detect very, very subtle differences between faces. Our brain seems to look for face information everywhere, even in something we consciously know is not a face. And we discussed examples of things that look like faces, even though we are certainly aware that they are not faces. And then something that we'll see again and again in this lecture is that face information seems to be processed astonishingly quickly. I mean, to the degree where consciously we don't even know we're looking at a face, but unconsciously, that little component of our brain seems to process faces and actually do things like make value judgments or moral judgments on faces, as we discussed with the example of Saddam Hussein. So we'll be talking about that sort of experiment a lot, where people are not conscious of seeing faces, but the face information still comes in. And then finally, we talked about this last example, and this has to do with prosopagnosia, which is probably something you've heard about at one point or another. maybe in a biology course or on TV, where people have damage to a certain part of their brain. I can show you since I have my brain here. It's a part in here called the fusiform gyrus. It's not important you know where that is or anything, or even its name. I don't think we talk about it. I think the book talks about it, but not sure it's on the exam. Just read through the book, you'll know enough. But I'm not interested in the technical aspects of course, more the conceptual aspects. And these are people who've had damage in this area that from a stroke, usually. And they, after they wake up from the stroke, they have difficulty recognizing faces. They can't recognize their family members. They can't recognize famous people from photographs. They can't even recognize themselves from photographs. And it's been something that's been reported for a long time. But something that's come out in the last 15, 20 years or so is that prosopagnosia is more complicated than we have assumed. As it turns out, there is evidence that people who report not being able to recognize faces actually can. And we know this not from their reports, because they'll say, I don't know who any of those photographs are of at all, even if they are famous people, even if they are their family members. But when they see somebody they should recognize, a family member, for example, themselves, for an example, they do show kind of a physiological reaction. So they'll show more sweat in their skin, as an example. And there's lots of easy ways of taking those measures. You put little sensors on the skin, like this is the sort of thing they do for lie detector tests. And when they see a famous face or a face of themselves or a loved one, they'll say, I have no idea who that is, but they'll show a little increase in the amount of sweat, and that will be a very systematic change. The other thing is even simpler. You don't need to get one of those sweat detectors. You can just show a prosopagnosia, a picture of a person, and under the picture there'll be a name, and their job will be to read that name as quickly as possible. Okay, so they'll see something like this. Okay, oops, sorry. They'll see something like this, and they'll see a picture of somebody, and underneath it will say a name either of that person, okay, Julia Roberts in this case, or of another person, Sandra Bullock. And their entire task, it's very simple, is you're going to see a picture of a famous person. I understand you're not going to recognize them, but read that name as quickly as possible. Okay. And so they'll look at the picture, they'll look at the name, they'll say Julia Roberts. Okay. If it in fact is a picture of Julia Roberts, they will read the name faster than if it's a picture of somebody else like Sandra Bullock. If they see Sandra Bullock's picture and under it says Julia Roberts, they'll read Julia Roberts a tiny bit slower. I mean, it's still, they have no problem reading, but it's a tiny bit slower if it's somebody if it's a name that's not associated with the picture. And then after that, they'll be asked, you know who that picture is? I'll say, nope, no idea. It looks like a woman. I don't know if it's Julia Roberts or not. But unconsciously, it looks like they are being what we call primed to read the name faster by the correctly associated photo. So this idea of prosopagnosics not being able to recognize faces suggests something a little bit different. It probably isn't exactly that. More, it has to do with people not being aware that they're recognizing a face. So even for these people who don't have a conscious awareness of recognizing faces, that face information gets in there and does either induce a small physiological response, like an increase in sweat, or a priming response where it will help them recognize a name, a red name, faster. So even in those cases, face information gets in, which is really interesting. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through and talk about all the types of information that a face can convey. And that's one of the reasons we felt like faces were so efficiently and effectively processed by the brain, because it conveys so much information so quickly. We talked about faces conveying identity information, faces conveying what we call intent, or maybe emotion. What a person intends towards us. Are they angry? Are they loving? Of course, the uh, the potential reproductive success one might have with a person could be conveyed in attractiveness and whether the person looks young and healthy to us. And then we talked quickly about lip reading and language information also being something that's conveyed through faces. So that's a lot of information. And the thing about faces is it conveys it immediately. We look at a face and we're getting all this information. As you'll see, the research really supports this. So let's talk about one of these things, facial expression. And I always smile when I look at these faces because these are the kind of standard faces they show in this type of research. Hold on just a second. Let me just get rid of this. I don't know if you've heard this story before, if you've taken intro psychology, it's the sort of thing you learn. That there's some evidence that faces express the same emotions in the same way across different cultures throughout history. And so the idea would be, research question, is this interpreted as a smile all over the world? Certainly we interpret it as a smile. Is it interpreted as a smile in a culture that doesn't have access to, Western sort of images? Papua New Guinea is one of the classic cases. If you test this image in a tribe that hasn't had access to Western images, will they interpret this as a smile as well? And if they do, then that might say something about, the biological basis of the brain's ability to interpret facial expression. And the research that you might have heard about suggests, yeah, there is a lot of universality. So even though, people in this tribe haven't necessarily seen Western images of Western stimuli taken in of Western, faces, that sort of thing, they very well might interpret that as a smile. So there is some evidence for cultural universality in that sense, but you're going to see that it does deviate a little bit. Because, I mean, one of the first things that's very clear is a concept called display rules. What is a display rule? It's generally the idea that to the degree that there is some cultural universality, different cultures kind of superimpose their own kind of, I don't know, constraints on expression. Here's the example I like to give. So I spent some time in London a number of years ago. I was doing a sabbatical there. And I remember going on the subway, the tube there in London. And, I'm friendly guys, so I'll often smile at people, strangers, just to, be nice and friendly. And what I noticed is people would smile back, but the smiles would be very kind of restricted. So you might see, I'm not very good at this, but smiling without opening their mouth or smiling without showing their teeth, kind of very subtle smiles. And maybe, people like this too. I certainly, have friends that don't do big, broad smiles. They're just more subtle. But this was a very common thing to see in London, especially in the morning in the subway. And then my wife came to visit me. She was my fiance at that point, and we traveled around rural England, and then went to Scotland. And oh my gosh, when I smiled at people in those locations, the smiles were very, very different. They were very broad. They were showing teeth. They would, I mean, and I didn't get the sense that they were necessarily a more friendly group, but their expressions were much more exaggerated, maybe amplified relative to what I saw in London. And that's a display rule difference, right? There are still smiles in both locations, but the smiles in more rural areas of England, um, uh, yeah, and in Scotland, even in the cities in Scotland, seem to be broader. In London, they seem to be a little bit more constrained. And um, I should have changed this. Really, I want you to concentrate on this. The strength of expression will be different in different cultures. And even we're talking about cultural differences between city dwellers and country dwellers, people, who live in a very congested city versus people who live in the country. And generally, the pattern is what I just conveyed to you with my anecdote about London and rural England, that folks in cities do seem to have more constrained smiles than folks who live in the country. There's theories about why that might be, but it's a very nice example of what we call display rules, where cultures will kind of impose constraints on how exaggerated, how amplified expressions are. So certainly there are some cultural universals, but there are also some cultural differences. Okay, that's kind of the point. And the other differences you see, let's go back to the example of Papua New Guinea versus folks in the West. What you see is this. So yeah, I mean, it is generally the case that that would be interpreted as a smile here in Southern California and in Papua New Guinea. The folks in that tribe would say, yes, that's a smile. But when it comes to within category, say, negative expressions, we would say this is sad, I think, but they might say this is more angry, okay? Where we would say, maybe this is disgust, they would say that is sad. Okay, so you see some kind of swaps within categories of positive and negative emotions. Okay, so they might say this is, as probably they'll say this is angry, they'll say this is disgust, or not disgust. We say this is disgust. They might say this is sad. They might say this is disgust or something, or this is disgust. Right? So they wouldn't say this is disgust or angry or sad. They'll say that's happy, right? So the category of happy versus positive versus negative emotions is still kind of universal. But what you have inside of those categories could be shifted around a little bit. So that's why I guess I want to make this point, that the universality is probably consistent when it comes to positive versus negative emotions, right? In Papua New Guinea, they're going to say this is a smile, right? They're going to say it's a positive emotion, and they're not going to say any of these things here are positive emotions, but they might say that this is anger or disgust instead of sadness. So the positive versus negative is something that's universal. Okay, cool. Let's continue to talk about facial expression and what goes on in the brain when it comes to facial expression. Well, like recognizing people, there is evidence that the brain can process facial expression amazingly quickly, even in situations where the stimuli are not consciously perceived. So here's another of these examples, where in an experiment, somebody would be sitting in front of a computer and be asked to do a test that has nothing to do with faces, at all. Okay. Actually, what I have here is right. Good. We can just use this one right here. So they could be asked to look at these images that come on the screen one at a time. And I guess, I don't know, are these Chinese characters? I'm not even sure. But it doesn't make a difference if I know or the subject knows for this task. They're just asked to say what they think of it. Is it a pretty character or is it a less pretty character? And it could be anything. It doesn't have to be a Chinese character. What do you think of this? Give it an aesthetic judgment. On a scale from 1 to 10, do you find this an attractive Chinese character or a less attractive, a less nice looking Chinese character on a scale from 1 to 10? So these come up one at a time, okay? And you have a row of buttons down here, and you press a button, say 2, 3, 8. I like this one. That's a nice looking one. I'll give it an 8, 7 or 8 at least. Okay, and I'm sure there'll be others that I'll give a 10 to. Okay, cool. Very simple. You know, it's very simple task. One other thing that happens every once in a while, you see a little flash on the screen, maybe that comes up right before the character, but they tell maybe they say something, they lie. They say, oh, we're having a little problem with our computer. Don't worry about those little flashes if something comes up on the screen. Concentrate on the Chinese character and just give us a rating. Okay, you and I know, because we're experimenters, we're perceptual psychologists, of course, are there, what's going on. Those little flashes that they usually don't even see as flashes are actually presentations of faces. And the faces that come up are either of a person smiling or a person frowning. They look like this, one of these two things. But there's multiple faces, not just a single person, of either the smiling or the frowning. There's lots of different faces, but they're either smiling or frowning. Okay. But again, they are shown so quickly that there's no way your conscious self, not only can it not recognize expressions, it can't even see it as faces. And not only that, it rarely sees even a flash on the screen. But a face is being presented super quickly before every Chinese character is being shown. And the question is that subliminally presented face going to have an effect over your aesthetic judgments on that character? Will a happy face boost your aesthetic judgment of the character, and will a sad face kind of suppress the aesthetic judgment of the character? And that's exactly what happens. If in fact a happy face is shown right before the Chinese character, it's likely that you'll think that Chinese character is a little prettier than if a sad face is being presented, even though you're never consciously aware that the faces are there. Okay, so it does have a judgment on your aesthetics when it comes to these Chinese characters. What else? Here's another example. Second experiment. New group of subjects come in, same deal. This time, though, they're not going to be asked to judge the Chinese characters. They're going to be asked to respond to hypothetical scenarios. Here's a hypothetical scenario. Okay, that's why I have this street on here, so it clues me in here and you. Imagine you are. It's late at night, maybe 2 o'clock in the morning. You're walking back from a party or something by yourself through a city, and it's dark. There's not a whole lot of lighting there, and you hear somebody behind you walking as well. Do you cross the street to be on the other side of the street for him, or her, to play it safe, or do you kind of maintain the side of the street you're on? And there's a lot of things that can play a role in this. I completely understand, right? How, whether, your personal experience and all that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of different scenarios, okay? Some that might be more threatening than others. And then you're shown this picture kind of to put you in the space of what it might be like to be in this scenario. And you're asked to push one of two judgments. Do you stay on the same side of the street? I'm not worried. There's a light up there. I should be fine. Or do you cross? You push another button. Stay on the same side, cross. Okay. Right before that image comes up, okay, you are being shown one of two faces, or one or two types of faces, either a happy smiling face or an angry face. Okay. All right. And again, it's shown with lots of different individuals. Okay. Angry, happy, but all of them are shown at a super fast rate. Again, too fast for you to ever notice. Never recognize an expression. You never are aware of seeing a face. Maybe every once in a while you notice a flash on the screen, but you believe it's something to do with the monitor having a problem. The question is, does it have an influence on how you're going to respond to the hypothetical scenario? And the answer is yes, it will. If you are being presented an angry face before you're asked to make the judgment of whether you'd stay on the same side of the street or cross over, okay, you'd be more likely to say you'd cross over than if you were shown a subliminally presented happy face. So it does have a bearing on these kind of hypothetical decisions people make, given a scenario they're posed with. And there's a whole series of them about what would you do in this situation? Would you be more likely to play it safe, or would you be okay? That sort of stuff. I would say being presented subliminally, unconsciously, a happy or angry face will influence it, even though you'll be unaware of what's going on. You'll never be aware of seeing a face. And finally, mood. And I should be very careful what I say here. I don't, because you'll see why. If you are being presented a happy or sad face subliminally, and then are asked to rate your own mood, okay, you're on a scale from 1 to 10, your mood ratings might be very slightly shifted. Very slightly shifted, and it will be for a very brief amount of time. So it's the same type of situation where you're asked to do a whole bunch of tasks, having nothing to do with mood. But then mood is asked at maybe the very last question. You're asked, what's your mood right now on a scale from 1 to 10? 10 being you're a happy person right now, you feel happy. 1 being, you're kind of cranky. What would you rate your mood to be? And yes, it would be influenced very subtly by being presented a subliminally shown face at super high speed, ones that you don't recognize. A sad face will suppress your mood rating. A happy face will elevate it a little bit. I'm trying to be very careful here because there are services on the internet that will show you happy faces to try to elevate your mood. I don't know if they charge, hopefully not. This effect, to be shown a series of happy faces again and again and again and again might elevate your mood a tiny bit, but it's going to be very short-lived. By the time the experiment's over, by the time the series is over, you're going to revert. So, I don't think it's worth certainly paying for those things or spending much time with them. But the fact that it has any influence at all is interesting. It is interesting that faces, especially the fact that I think that these are, when these are subliminally shown, that they can have an effect. But it's a very short-lived and very subtle effect when it comes to some changes in mood. Now, I should say one other thing just to remind you about the power of these things. In all of these experiments, at the end, people are asked if they saw anything but the relevant stimuli, the stimuli they judged on the screen. And almost always people will say, nope, I didn't see anything at all. In a set of, say, 50 subjects in an experiment, maybe a few will say, I saw a couple of flashes on the screen, but I don't know what they were. I thought maybe the monitor was broken. Okay, and maybe at the very end they say, one more question. Do you remember ever seeing any faces? Out of 50 subjects, none of them will report seeing any faces at all. And this is always an important component of the experiment, to make sure that these stimuli were never consciously recognized as faces. Okay, this is all subliminal influence, which is really pretty powerful. Okay, let's continue to talk about these subliminal influences. In these examples, in this next example, actually, we're going to do an experiment. Here, we're going to talk about an experiment where these faces are shown for long periods of time. So this will not, at this point, be a subliminally presented experiment, but you're going to see the effects are kind of secretive in a way, or hidden, mysterious. And this has to do with inadvertent imitation. So we're going to talk a lot about imitation on Thursday. But this is an interesting place to start that discussion. Because in this experiment, what goes on is subjects will be shown on a computer screen a series of photos of people, strangers. And they'll be shown for long periods of time because the subjects will be asked to do things that are actually unrelated to the purpose of the experiment, but kind of involve some concentration. So I don't know, let's say faces are shown one at a time and you're asked to make judgments on how old you think these people are. So one face, you just type in, they look to be like in their mid 30s, 35. Next one comes up, 22. Next one comes up, oh, they look like maybe they're in their 60s or something like that. Okay, we're better at, some people are better at this than others. It's funny. You tend to do well in whatever age range you're in, just for your information. But we all can do this to some degree. It's not the purpose of the experiment. It's a hidden purpose because the camera on the computer is actually on. Okay, and you're told this. You say, okay, we're just going to leave the camera on to make sure you're concentrating. And what it is actually detecting is something about what you're doing. Okay, because as these faces come up, they're just taken out of normal candid shots, photographs. You see in a magazine, a paper, just from the campus. And sometimes these images, these images of faces, the people are shown smiling, and sometimes they're not. Okay? But you don't care. Your job is just to rate the age. But here's what's going on. When you see an image of a smiling face, your face will inadvertently, it will unwillfully do a very slight imitation of that smile. Okay, and that's what you're seeing here. Here, what you're seeing are photographs that are taken from the computer's camera of the subject looking at the faces. So this is actually a subject. These are both subjects that the camera is capturing here. These subjects are actually looking at the screen and judging age. And this is that subject, one subject, who's looking at an image of a face that's, just in a neutral expression. Here's that subject now looking at a different face, and it's a face of a person smiling. Now, that subject is not aware that they are imitating the expression they see. Again, their whole job is just to, rate the age, just guess the age. That's it. It's very simple, very simple. But when a smiling face comes up, they will do a subtle smile. Now, okay, here, making sure I'm pointing at it so you can see the pointer. Okay, in this case, okay, you can see that, it's a visible smile she's doing, but it might not always be. Before we talk about that it might be even a more subtle smile, I just wanted to show you that the same experiment works if you don't show neutral and smiling faces, but instead show neutral and kind of disappointed faces or sad faces. And here what you're seeing is a subject who's imitating the facial expression by lowering their brow a little bit. I'm trying to see if I can express that. Yeah. It's a subtle thing. Okay. Oops. It's a subtle thing, but they will show that imitation. Now, what I meant by it maybe sometimes not being this obvious is there's other ways of measuring whether this imitative response happens. Okay. Yeah, you can use the camera to see if that happens, but sometimes it's going to be a very subtle thing. So they'll use muscle recording, and that's just a very, very simple thing to do. What you do is you just take little stickers that have little wires connected to them, and then they're connected to a computer, and put them around the mouth. Okay, so they're actually over the muscles of the mouth. Well, also they'll put them up here so they can capture the brow lowering as well. They're not going into muscles or anything like that. It's a very simple thing. You just put it over the skin. And so what you can do is test whether the muscles that are associated with the imitative expressions are actually engaged, even if whatever is going on in the subject's face is too subtle to actually produce a visual imitation of the expression they're seeing. So it's another way of measuring imitation. And as you can see, a lot of these expressions are very subtle. So if you put these electrodes, these little surface electrodes on the skin, you can determine that even if it's not visible, even if I can't see the subjects doing that imitative expression, I can measure to see if their muscles that are associated with that expression are engaged. And the answer is yes. And this happens pretty systematically. Again, subjects are never told to imitate the expressions. Okay, they're just told to rate age. And in fact, at the end of the experiment, they're asked, were you aware that maybe you were imitating the expressions you saw? And they'll say, no, I don't think I was doing that at all. I was just, judging the age of the photos I've seen. I don't think I imitated anybody. Like, okay, that's fine. They are unaware of it. That's what I mean by inadvertent, but it happens. And maybe you've heard this kind of idea before that a smile is contagious, right? Maybe your parents told you that, and in a very kind of broad way, we know that's true, right? I smile at people at the grocery store. Okay, I know I'm goofy. Listen, this is what happened. I've always been friendly, but after COVID, I just felt like everybody needed to smile at each other, especially after were able to take our masks off. It was so long after that it had been so long since we had seen smiles. I was just like, let's smile at each other in the stores. Come on, everybody, let's smile at each other at intersections when we're in our cars waiting. It's like, come on, we're alive. We made it. We supported each other. We made it through this terrible period. Everybody deserves a smile, and I got to continue to do it. And I'm so aware of how it's contagious, right? People will often smile back. So it is contagious in that very kind of conscious way, but it's also contagious in this unconscious way. So even if I smile at somebody and they don't realize they're smiling back at me, there is this very subtle engagement of their smile muscles, which is really interesting. It really kind of speaks to the idea that the imitation system as well as the expression system is really, something almost that's overriding what we intend to do with our faces. The experiments show that these same sort of effects can occur in situations where the faces are shown too quickly to consciously recognize. So in this experiment here, we can go back to this, experiment where people are asked to judge the aesthetics of a Chinese character. Okay. If they are shown smiling versus frowning faces or something like that, not only will it have an effect on how one judges the aesthetics of this character, it will also induce very subtle but systematic imitations of those expressions. Again, they're tiny imitations, right? And in these cases, no faces are ever consciously recognized. So these imitations I just discussed can also work with stimuli that are shown at too fast a rate to ever be consciously recognized. Okay, so yes, they can be subliminally induced. And finally, these subliminally induced expressions, okay, are going to influence the emotion if, in fact, okay, imitation is allowed. Now, I'm being a little hesitant here too, because I think it's pretty much been replicated, but it's one of these experiments that since the book came out has been a little bit more challenged. But if you are asked to do something with your face that constrains your ability to imitate somebody inadvertently, okay? So in these experiments, people are asked to put a pencil either in their lips, hold a pencil in their lips, or in their teeth. Okay, looking at my picture to make sure you guys can see that. It's a very simple task, a pencil or a pen, okay, in their lips or their teeth. What that will do is it will put their mouths into one expression or another. Let's put it in their lips. Let's put it in their lips. Okay, so people are asked to hold a pencil in their lips, and maybe it has something to do, I don't know, you're going to press a key later on, so you feel comfortable doing this. There's some sort of cover story. And then they're shown these pictures that were known before to elevate mood just a little bit, elevate emotion just a little bit. If a person's expression, imitative expression, is constrained with the pencil in their lips, seeing the face smiling will not elevate emotion as much as it normally would, suggesting that these imitative expressions that seem almost reflexive might be involved in whatever emotion elevation a reflexive smile might have, which is interesting. So this inadvertent imitation might be part of the slight but kind of statistically significant increased mood that happens when we see a smiling face. If we can't engage those imitative muscles, that increase in emotion, in happiness will not happen, suggesting that these muscles are also involved in our own emotions to some degree. We'll come back to this later when we talk about imitation again. But I wanted to talk about it first here since we're talking about faces. Cool. Any questions on this? People sometimes wonder about, how powerful this is, how well it works. I say these are all very subtle things, but the fact that they happen at all, and they always that all these things happen with subliminally presented faces, I think really speak to the fact that your brain is so sensitive to faces and processes face information so efficiently that you are a face specialist in some ways. Okay, then we're going to move on and talk about whether we can judge personality from faces, and this story. Well, the background of the story. Don't judge a book by its cover. That's what we say when somebody kind of quickly makes judgments about another person just by looking at them. Okay. And of course that's true, right? I mean, we all have examples where we first meet somebody and we kind of size them up and kind of decide, okay, they're probably going to be this type of person or that type of person, or I don't think I'm ever going to be friends with this person or not that person. And we're always surprised by people, which is wonderful, right? Often pleasantly surprised, by people. You first meet somebody, they seem kind of grouchy, they don't smile very much, and you get to know them and they're lovely and they end up being your friend forever, right? Those are wonderful examples. So yes, you should not judge a book by its cover, but in a way, your brain can't help but do that, right? So if you look at these two faces, these two women who are, probably in their late 60s, something like that. Okay. And I would to ask you, which one do you think is more pleasant? Which one do you think is kind of just a more cheerful, kind of pleasant person? The one on the left or the one on the right? I think maybe we maybe agree. For whatever reason, I would think that maybe many of us would say the person on the left looks like just a tiny bit more pleasant than the person on the right, which is true because this person right here is a picture. This is a picture of my mom. No, I'm kidding. It's not my mom. Just wanted to see if you were awake. These are strangers. These are stimuli from a paper. But there is some consistency where people are at when subjects are asked these questions. And one thing that seems very clear, is that your brain can't help but, kind of make impression, have an impression of a face, and it happens very, very quickly, within 1/10 of a second, and then it's maintained until you really get to know somebody. So it's like, I know my brain's not supposed to do this. My parents told me, my church told me not to do this, whatever. My teachers told me not to do this. I shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but you meet somebody and you can't help but do that. I mean, your brain kind of has been evolutionarily designed to do that to some degree. Fortunately, it's also been evolutionarily designed to overcome that eventually. But boy, your brain goes bam like that. Oh, they seem cranky, they seem happy, they seem, maybe they're a bit of a narcissist, something like that. We can't help but do this quickly, and it happens very quickly, and then we kind of maintain that until we get to know them. And research suggests something similar. So let's talk about faces that are of this age, okay? And so these are experiments that were done with elderly faces where these women were photographed maintaining either neutral faces or making expressions of happy, sad, angry, those sort of things that you saw before. And then they were shown to people, and they were asked to judge things about their personality. Okay, so they're making neutral expressions, or happy face expressions, sad face expressions, and they were and the subjects, that didn't know these women were asked to make judgments about them. How happy do you think this person is? Do they have an easygoing nature? Do they have more of a tense nature? Are they more likely to be worried? Are they more likely to be sad? That sort of thing. And they actually had these personality profiles of these women, and you might know something about how those are done. There's something called the Big Five Personality Questionnaire. I don't know if you ever learned this anywhere through school at any point, but typically, there'll be a series of questions that say, how often do you worry about the future? How often are you able to savor the small joys in your life? And it provides some sort of personality evaluation. And so these women had those personality evaluations. So they actually, the researchers knew something about their personality, as much as a questionnaire can tell you. And, if you talk to personality psychologists, they'll say, yeah, you don't need that many questions to learn something about people. Okay, I don't know about that, but I'll trust my colleagues. Okay. So now the question is, when subjects looked at these faces and then judged personality traits from these faces, were they somewhat accurate? And the answer is, yeah, they were. They were not too bad. I mean, certainly they weren't perfect, right? Looking at these two faces, but if in fact you would say this person looks like maybe they're a little bit more easygoing than this person over here, okay, there would be some difference in their personality tests where this person actually, based on those personality tests, is a more easygoing person than this person over here. Okay, so there's some ability to do that. Okay, so why would that be the case? How does that work? How does that work? Well, let's think about why might a person's face give away something about their personality. And here's a bunch of ideas on this, or here's not a bunch of two ideas on this. One is something called a self-fulfilling prophecy. It may be a new term for you, at least in the context of faces. Here's how it pertains to faces. Maybe you were born with a more cheerful looking face or a more, sullen looking face, a face that looks a little bit more serious. Okay. Imagine you're born with a more cheerful face. You got big cheeks when you were a kid, you have big cheeks, and it makes you look, kind of like you're smiling. Oh, hold on just a second. I've got to close the door because Somebody's here. My doggy's barking. Speaking of happy faces, I'll be right back. I'm teaching you here. Thank you. Okay. So you have big cheeks, when you're a little guy, little gal, and you look cheerful. It's just the way your face came out. Just you have the kind of, the anatomy of a cheerful looking little dude or gal, and people start treating you like you're a happy little person. Okay. And so you get a lot of feedback as if you're a happy person just because of the way your face looks. So it could be that when this person was very tiny, they looked happy and people treated them happy. Where if this person, was little, she looked a little less happy. And so she was treated as a less happy person. If that happens throughout a person's lifetime, being treated as a happy person versus being treated as a more serious person, okay, that could have an influence on a person's personality, right? So your faith, you're kind of born with a kind of general kind of expression. Again, your neutral face kind of has a type of expression, and then your personality kind of grows into that expression. This person's treated as a happy person, so they end up, being a happy person when it comes to the personality tests. They coming out as a happy person on the personality test. This person is treated a little bit more serious. So what self-fulfilling prophecy it means here is that your personality kind of grows into the way you look because of how you're being treated by other people. That is one possibility for why there might be a correlation between a person kind of their neutral face looking happy and being happy versus looking a little bit more serious and being a little more serious. Okay, that's one explanation. The other one, okay, and both, I should say both of these can be partially true, but the other one has to do with what type of expressions your face goes throughout your lifetime. This is called expressive habits. And what this means is the following. If you are a person who's had a lot of happy things happen in their life, you would smile a lot. And smiling a lot changes your face, as does frowning a lot, as does smiling less. Because let's think about what faces are. Faces are a lot of things, but in terms of what the facial structure is, faces are basically skin with muscle. And we know from, doing exercises, hopefully we all do exercises, multiple times a week, right? That we can change how our bodies look by exercising, right? If we do a lot of bicep curls, our biceps will get big, right? And our faces are the same thing. Our faces change with exercising too. And if we exercise our face by doing a lot of smiles through our lives, there'll be structural changes in our faces, like there's structural changes in our muscles when we're exercising our arms and our legs and all that sort of thing. So expressive habits, if we have a habit of smiling a lot, because those are the sort of interactions we have, those are the sort of responses from events in our life, then in fact our face will structurally change to show, in a sense, that we've been smiling a lot. Or if you've been smiling less because we've had a hard life. I know people have, certainly there's people go through very tough times in their life, and maybe those times last for a while. Okay? If they've had a difficult time, they'll likely smile less. Okay? And that will also show in how the muscles in their face have developed over time. So think of a face like muscles, or as a set of muscles that are showing how our faces have been exercised over the course of our lives. And that might be another reason we might look like our personalities to some degree. Again, I'm going to step back here and say, let's not overdo this. We know that, it's not good to judge a book by its cover, right? We always are surprised by people, often pleasantly surprised by people. It could very well be that this person is a super sweet person and very happy and will be, a very loving, kind person. Maybe this person's not, right? Who knows? We're always going to find deviations, right? But, if you look at the big data over the big picture, yeah, we're not too bad at judging personality from faces. All right, here is, I think, even a more astonishing example of this. There's a little demonstration you can do now with ourselves. I'm going to show you images of two faces, and I want you to choose which one, the one on the left or the one on the right, is, I guess, the better example of a personality trait. Let me show you what I mean. Who is more agreeable, the person on the left or the person on the right? The woman on the left or the woman on the right? And I know these are very, very similar faces. I mean, they could be sisters, right? But if you had to say one is more agreeable, is the person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. You could just make a note to yourself. Okay. Who's more conscientious, the person on the left or the person on the right? I know it's subtle. I know it's subtle, but who do you think would be more conscientious? Who would you prefer to have working with you on a group project, the person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. Who's more extroverted, person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. Who do you think's more of an extrovert? Who do you think's more likely to, come up to you at a party, person on the left or the person on the right? Who's more neurotic, person on the left or the person on the right? I know these are hard. There's very subtle differences, and you'll learn why there's subtle differences. Who's more adventurous, person on the left or the person? Who's more likely to try new things, the person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. These are all part of an experiment, as is this next question, just so you know. Which of these two people would be more likely to be open to casual sex, the person on the left or the person on the right? Okay, these are all part of the experiment, so just so you know. Okay, now these are really interesting faces, and I'll tell you why. Here we are. Here are the faces, and also I also added some for men as well. And what I actually just showed you, remember we just talked about the Big Five personality questionnaire. Those are considered, it's called the Big Five because those are considered to be the five core personality traits. So you end up, after you take this questionnaire of, I think it's like 50 questions or something like that, they can tell, supposedly personality psychologists can tell how agreeable you are, how conscientious you are, how extroverted, how neurotic, how open to new experiences you might be. And then that last question, sexual openness. Okay, so, I don't know, I'm not a personality psychologist, but I believe that, they feel pretty confident they can tell from these questionnaires. Okay, so here's the experiment. Let's do this. I showed you here with men's faces, but this actually seems to work better with people, both men and women, making judgments on the women's faces. So that's why I did that demonstration with you folks. So let's think of the experiment that way. The researchers bring in 100 women and take pictures of them, and they take pictures to make sure that they're very kind of systematic. So they're all kind of cropped in the same way. They're all taken from the same distance. They're all put in the same frame. Their clothes are kind of marked off, and their hair is kind of fuzzed out and everything. That's fine. Cool. They take pictures of each of the women, and then they actually have them go through the questionnaire, including a question about is it something, do you participate in the hookup culture, or something about sexual openness? I don't know the specific questions. Okay. And then what they do is they look at the questionnaire responses, and they then look at the 10 women, let's go with, say, conscientiousness. They look at the 10 women whom, based on the questionnaire, are the most conscientious of the 100. Which 10 women are the most conscientious, and which 10 women are the least conscientious based on this questionnaire? Okay, cool. Now we have two groups that are very, very different in conscientiousness, at least based on this questionnaire test. Now what they do is they take the images of those 10 women and superimpose them on each other. So they get an averaged face of the most conscientious women in the group and the least conscientious women in the group. Okay. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing an image that's the average of the most conscientious and the least conscientious women in the group, the 10 most and the 10 least. Same with agreeableness, same with extroversion, same with neuroticism, same with openness to new experiences, and the same to sexual openness as well. And now what they do is the experiment that you just experienced, right? And they use a lot of different questions, and they do it with men's and women's faces and all that sort of thing. But they are interested in whether naive subjects who don't know any of these 100 women, okay, are going to be able to make these judgments. And the answer is yes, at better than chance levels. And they're not perfect. But I think in these cases, the second woman here is the example of the most agreeable, the most conscientious, the most extrovert. I'm pretty sure that's right. As you can see, they're very similar, and they should be very similar because the pictures are taken. They're all young undergraduates. The pictures are intentionally taken to be very similar in terms of the distance and all that, and they are actually derived from a number of faces, 10 faces each. So they're going to be, average faces. So they're not going to include all the other things in these faces, such as wrinkles and all the kind of individual kind of characteristics. It's a much more general thing about kind of the general form, the general shape of these characteristics, right? Which is interesting. And yeah, subjects can do this at better than chance levels. Now, again, I should say they only found this with men and women subjects judging female faces. They weren't able to do this with any consistency when it came to judging male faces. And there's subtle effects. Not everybody can look at these and do them right away. I'm sure that, you were probably somewhat, inconsistent in judging these and all that sort of thing. It's difficult. But when it comes to looking at the big data, there are differences. And so it looks like there is some evidence that the kind of general form, the general kind of very general shape of a person's face does convey something about personality characteristics. Who knows what this is, right? I don't know if the research has been followed up to determine what about these faces conveys that information about whether somebody is extroverted or not, conveys that information about whether they're neurotic or not. I don't know if they've determined that, but there is something in it. And also, is this based on, self-fulfilling prophecy? Maybe the 10 women who had the most, responded most as having the most neurotic personalities versus the least neurotic personalities became that way, neurotic, unneurotic, okay, because of how their faces looked when they were little and they were treated that way, right? Their personalities grew into their faces. Or maybe just their personalities kind of shaped their faces so that, they formed over time in a way that conveyed high neuroticism versus conveyed low neuroticism. Okay, whatever it was, it's subtle and can be, kind of extracted to find an average in 10 faces from these different sides of the personality continuum. Okay. Now, let's think about these self-fulfilling prophecy expressive habits difference in one more way. I think you're going to find this interesting. And I think this may give some support to the expressive habits theory, maybe being a little bit more, powerful in this situation. It could be could be both, but maybe expressive habits are playing a role, at least in this next phenomenon. And maybe you've seen this before, noticed this before, or thought about this before. Maybe you have it in your own family. Parents, do your parents look like each other? Do your aunt and uncle look like each other? Well, there is some evidence that this does happen. And, you can go online and find websites that show you photos of couples who look a whole lot like each other. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon, just kind of, from a, kind of general public sort of perspective, but also from a kind of science perspective. And why would people in a couple look like each other? Why would they look like each other? There could be a lot of reasons for this, right? People often marry and date within their own ethnicity, right? Their own socioeconomic class. So maybe their background nutrition plays a role or something like that. But there's another way to look at it, and that is, yes, all these things probably do have a role in why spouses look like each other, certainly, right? Just to think about the ethnicity thing, right? They're going to have, if they marry within their ethnicity, there's going to be an obvious similarity, skin tone, and things like that. That's fine. But here's another question: do individuals in a couple grow to look more like each other over time? Do they converge in facial appearance? Okay, so that's a different question in a way, right? So yeah, it could be that they look a lot like each other when they were first married or first together, but over the course of 20, 30, 40 years, do they look more like each other as time goes on? So this was studied, and it's been studied a number of times. And so what the experimenters will typically do is ask couples to come in, and they'll take photos of them as they are now, older couples especially. They'll take photos of couples when they're in their 70s. But they'll also say, bring in some wedding pictures. We'd love to see some wedding pictures. And so they'll bring in wedding pictures of them standing next to each other. And then they'll bring evaluators in to evaluate, how much these two people look like each other when they were young and how much they look like each other when they're old. And they bring in judges of all ages because, again, as I said before, we're most sensitive to the age group that we're in because we spend more time with that age group. So right now, I'm not sure I'd be very good at judging, the similarity between people in their 20s and 30s and stuff like that, because I hang out with a lot of people, besides my own kids, I hang out with a lot of people in their 60s, right? And I'm good at judging people in their 60s. But they bring in all types in these sort of experiments to, get a very general idea of how much these people look like each other. And in other experiments, they actually measure how much they look like each other, using measurements on the photos and things like that. Okay. Do spouses end up growing to look more like each other over time? And the answer is often yes, but not always. What makes the difference? What is it that allows them to either become more like each other or not to become more like each other? And as it turns out, in these experiments, not only do the couples come to the lab and have their photos taken in their 70s and have and bring in photos from their wedding or when they started dating or whatever. They also answer questions about their relationship, on their own. Okay, now we're going to put you in different rooms. I'm going to have you go through a questionnaire about your relationship. And the questionnaire will involve questions about how empathetic they believe they are towards each other. How supportive are they of each other? How, when one person goes through an emotion, does the other person kind of, are they empathetic with that emotion? When there's an issue with the family, there's problems with a child or a grandparent, are they both involved in solving the problem? That sort of thing. And you might know this, that not all couples are like this, and maybe they started out like that, but as they went on, they became, really less empathetic. They, grew apart or whatever, that sort of thing. Okay. But what they found was this: the more empathy people reported in their relationship, the more like these spouses grew to look like each other, which is really interesting, right? Because what it suggests is that when they were empathetic to each other, as each of the members of the couple were going through different emotions, it meant that they probably shared emotion and shared expressions as these things were happening. Okay, which means they shared expressive habits, and that changed their look. It changed the form of their faces. It probably changed wrinkles and all that stuff too, but it helped them grow to look more like each other. So that's, kind of, it's interesting, first of all, that it happens. It's been measured, and it kind of is influenced by how much empathy is in the relationship. But it's also, I think, some interesting support for the idea that expressive habits do change our faces in ways that then tell the world something about our personalities. Okay. So it depends on the empathy, which means that the more shared empathy, the more the couples grow to look like each other, the more it kind of tells the world something about personality. Our expressive habits form our face shapes, change our face shapes, and tell something to the world about our personalities. Okay, cool. Which brings up the question everybody always has when I talk about this, and I completely understand this. Do I look like my dog? Now, I got this from a dog food advertisement in a magazine. I'm sure this is something that you've thought about before, right? I think I look just like my dog. I should be so lucky. I've got a really cute dog. But, you've probably thought this before when you've seen people with their dogs at the dog park or whatever, right? Is it true that people look like their dog? And boy, was I hoping to find that there was evidence for this when I was writing the book. I did not. I don't know if there is now evidence of this, but here's what I found. If you take pictures of people and their dogs at a dog park, this is what the research suggests. Okay, so the experimenters went to a number of dog parks, took pictures of their dog, took pictures of the dog, took pictures of their owners, and then brought them back to the lab, and then asked people to make matches based on which dog belonged to which owner. In fact, subjects could do this at better than chance levels. Okay, they say, yeah, this dog owner probably owns this dog. Okay, this dog owner probably owns this dog. And they could actually do it at better than chance levels, right? They weren't just randomly guessing. There did seem to be some ability to do this. However, if you then have a different group of subjects come in and say, and perform the task, which dog looks like which owner, not which one is the owner of this dog, but which one looks more like this owner. Okay. People do not then match based on dog to owner. Okay. Right? They don't. In fact, it could very well be that this woman here owns this dog. Okay, I'm just using this as an example, right? And maybe you'd make that match. I mean, these are so kind of exaggerated. Maybe you'd make that match in terms of who owns who, right? But you'd say this dog certainly looks more like this guy, right? In other words, yeah, you can, at better than chance levels, tell who owns what dog, but it doesn't seem to be based on how they look, at least facial and body similarity. So at least in 2010, there was no evidence that this was happening, that or that people were likely to have a dog that looked like them or vice versa. I think we like to think that's the case, but there's no evidence, at least as far as I know. All right, cool. Let's go on and talk about something to do with faces and now the brain. So we're actually going to now go to the brain and talk about this question: whether there seems to be evidence that that part of the brain processes faces different than it processes any other information. Now, let me rephrase that. Does the brain overall, okay, process faces differently from how it processes non-face images? So all these effects that I've been talking about with regard to, so efficiently processing expression, processing other sorts of characteristics. You'll learn about that attractiveness, and I think last week they talked a little bit about attractiveness, but we also process attractiveness that quickly too. Discussion section, your TAs talked about it, and the book talks about it. I mean, all this facial information that the brain processes, is it something specific to faces? Is there something about faces that kind of support a different type of processing than how the brain processes other images, like images of dogs, images of cars and bicycles and houses and stuff? Is there a different set of processes that the brain goes through? So it's one thing to say, yeah, that this little component here seems to be at least somewhat involved in face processing. We now know it probably isn't just face processing, it's probably being aware of face processing. But does it do a process that's different from how the rest of the brain might process other images? Okay, are there face-specific processes? And there's quite a history of looking at this in the research. One of the most famous effects that seems to suggest maybe there is something special about faces when it comes to how the brain processes the images is this. You've been looking at this image, and I'm sure by now you probably recognize who this is. Yeah, you probably know who this is, right? You should know this is Hillary Clinton. It's an older picture of her. Hopefully most of you recognized her, though. But look how much easier it is to recognize her when she is upright versus upside down. Oops. Here she is upside down, here she is upright. And that's a very well-known phenomenon, that there seems to be something kind of super easy when you're seeing an upright versus upside down face. You're inverting a face makes it much harder to recognize. We process upright faces much easier than we process upside down faces, which maybe, I mean, we have certainly more familiarity with upright faces than upside down faces, but it seems to be disproportionately different. That inversion disproportionately makes faces harder to recognize when they are upside down than right side up. This is what I mean by disproportionately is, you invert pictures of a house or a bicycle or a doggy or something like that. Yeah, it might make it a little bit harder to recognize it as a dog or a house or an airplane or something like that. But boy, when you invert a picture of a face, it makes it much harder to recognize, which has led some scientists to think that there must be all these kind of special things that we've been seeing about faces really have to do with upright faces. And so if there's a specialization for faces, it really is an upright specialization that only is applied to when we look at faces upright. Okay. So it's been suggested that when we look at upright faces, we're actually doing two kind of separate but simultaneous analyses on the face. We are looking, as we look at Hillary Clinton, at the features of her face, but also we are looking at the configuration of the features. So we're looking at her eyes, those are features. We're looking at her mouth, there's a feature. But we're also looking at the configuration. How far above the mouth are the eyes? How far above the chin is the nose? So we look at these features relative to each other. We look at the configuration of the features. So we do two simultaneous, our brain is doing two simultaneous analyses on information on faces. The information that's associated with individual features and the information that's associated with the configuration, the spatial relationship between those features. That's what's meant here by configural information, the spatial relationship between these features. And that could be that kind of simultaneous dual processing of the feature information and the configural information, the spatial relation between those features, could be something unique to when we look at upright faces. It's not true when we look at upright houses, pictures of upright houses or upright doggies or upright bicycles or any of the other sorts of images we encounter. It's true only of upright faces. In fact, it's not true of upside down faces. Because once you turn a face upside down, okay, the configurations completely change, right? Yeah, you can still say there's, the feature of the eyes, but we can no longer say the eyes are so far above the mouth, right? They're now below, right? And the nose is so far above the chin, it's now below. So it could be that this kind of superpower of our face recognition ability, so that we can process emotion and attractiveness and identity of faces, even if they are shown too quickly for us to actually have conscious awareness of, is based on the brain's dual processing of configural and featural information. And it's that configuration, okay, that added configural processing of faces that is going to allow us to have that efficiency in face recognition, and also, not just face recognition, I should mention, also emotion and attractiveness and all those things. And again, that's considered to be specific to faces, not true of doggies. Okay, so when we're looking at doggies, we don't do a configural analysis. When we're looking at houses, we don't do a configural analysis. We only do that extra analysis, that extra simultaneous analysis when we're looking at upright faces. Once we invert the face, we lose that ability, and we then are processing a face. When it's inverted, we're processing it like we process all other images. It's not until we see that upright face that all of a sudden we see the face pop out, and we see the emotion, and all those things pop out immediately because of that extra configural analysis. Okay? Cool. Almost done with this slide, and then we'll take our little break. Let's talk a little bit more about the how inversion kind of inhibits this configural analysis. And I got a fun example I just put together today, at least this example of it I just put together today, because I saw it being posted all over the internet, which is good. There's a new example of this with somebody you recognize. This is going to be easy for a person for you to recognize, probably. Yeah, it's Adele, right? And if I asked you, is there anything weird about this? Say, no, if I look at it a little bit, yeah, it seems like there's some weird stuff maybe in the eyes. Yeah. Well, let me turn the picture over for you so you can see what's going on. Yeah, there's that beautiful woman, Adele. But as you can see, her eyes have been kind of turned upside down and her mouth has been turned upside down. But look how much easier that is to notice when her face is upright versus inverted. So what happens here is that the upright face, even though it's the same thing there, the upright face highlights these distortions in Adele's face so that it's clear what's going on. And boy, does she look funny. I would say even scary, okay? Even a little scary. And she's a beautiful woman with a beautiful voice, so she shouldn't look that scary. But this is now the modern example of a very well-known phenomenon that's been around since the 70s or 80s, maybe it was the 80s, called the Margaret Thatcher effect. And you might not know who Margaret Thatcher is. She was the Prime Minister of England in the 80s, tough woman, very conservative. There was a movie about her with Meryl Streep, I think about 10 years ago, maybe less than that, called The Iron Lady or something. But it's called the Margaret Thatcher effect because this demonstration of inverting features and that being noticeable only really, or very much more noticeable only really when the face is upright, was originally done with her face. Okay, that's why it's called the Margaret Thatcher effect. Maybe it will change now to the Adele effect, but when the paper was originally published reporting this discovery, they used Margaret Thatcher's effect, so they called it the Margaret Thatcher effect. That's not that important for you to know why it's called the Margaret Thatcher effect, but what's important for you to know is, again, how much easier it is to recognize when the distortions in the face when it is upright versus inverted. There seems to be something about upright faces, and it might have to do with our ability, our brain's ability, that when we're looking at upright faces, we're doing two parallel analyses on the face. We're doing an analysis of the features, and we're doing an analysis of the configuration between the features, and that's only done with upright faces. It's not done with upright doggies or upright houses, and it's only done with faces when they are upright. Once it's inverted, once a face is inverted, whether it's Margaret Thatcher, Hillary Clinton, or Adele, okay, we can no longer do that external configural process. And therefore we have the same trouble with inversion, whether it's a face or a doggy or a house or whatever, because we can't use that configural process. Once it goes back up, once Adele goes back up, okay, our configural processes immediately come back in and we become super sensitive to faces. So at least by some accounts, some scientists' accounts, okay, it's upright faces. Okay, it's the upright faces that induce this configural processing that then allows this kind of hypersensitivity to faces. Okay, cool. Let's take our little break here, and then we'll come back and switch our topic to talk about imitation. So let's take our 10-minute break. Okay, let me just get a second here to set up. My doggy's been giving me some issues. He's barking at our cleaning lady with the vacuum. So hold on just a second here. Naughty doggy. Okie dokie. So, show. Good. Okay. This will just take a second. Let me get. Yeah. Good. Good. Okay. So, let me share my screen. Good. Good. How are we doing here? Good. We're still recording. Everybody happy? All right. Testing. Yeah, everything's good. Okay. So we're going to shift our discussion to imitation now. And, already saw a tiny bit of this in the last lecture having to do with faces. But this imitation story has kind of become one of the kind of more interesting modern kind of discoveries of perceptual psychology and I guess the brain in general. And that is that I think until, say, 15 years ago, we were really not very aware of how much our brain is actually performing imitation, even if our bodies don't seem to be. So, we all know that we have an ability to imitate, whether we're trying to imitate our siblings to bug them, or, trying to imitate a famous person, or maybe Adele's singing style or something like that. We have some idea of how to do this. But what most of us probably are unaware of is how often the body and the brain are actually doing imitation, even when we're not attempting to do so. And sometimes this kind of pops up. So maybe when you're at a party and you're talking with somebody, you might notice yourself kind of standing in the same postures as them. Um, or putting your hands, at your sides if they are, that sort of thing, crossing your legs if somebody else is crossing their legs. Every once in a while we notice that type of thing. The other example I like to uh, mention in this situation is accents, and it's actually something my lab has started to study. Um, we we're interested in the type of experience that we have when we're talking with somebody that has a heavy foreign accent and we notice ourselves imitating it a little bit. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. It kind of happens to me a lot. I'll get really engaged in a conversation with somebody that, has either a heavy dialectical accent, or maybe from the South, or the southern region of the U.S., Texas, or something like that, or maybe has an accent from another language, and all of a sudden I'll find myself kind of imitating it a little bit, and I'll be very embarrassed. And if I'm there with other folks that are native speakers, they'll notice and laugh. What we're interested in my lab, just so you're aware, is that we're wondering whether or not the person who's being imitated that has the foreign accent notices when you do that, when you kind of mistakenly, inadvertently imitate them. And so far, we're finding that the answer is no, they really don't notice. So maybe we shouldn't be as embarrassed as we feel we are. So we're probably not offending them in a noticeable way, but we haven't reached our final conclusion on that yet. Anyway, it's known that we inadvertently imitate postures and speech, as I just said, and now you know about the facial expressions. Um, I have to, sorry, I have to let my doggy out. I'll be right back. You're a naughty dog. No barking. So what he likes to do is bark at the vacuum cleaner. And supposedly, according to our cleaning person, um, he only will do it while there's somebody home in the family. He won't do it if it's just her and him. If there's nobody home and she's here cleaning, he'll be fine. But he's trying to protect us from the vacuum cleaner. So it's hard to get really angry. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about this research having to do with imitation. And some of the early experiments on this that had to do, when researchers start doing experiments on a first pass on things, very often they try to make it as easy as possible, and they, look for ways of studying this that are very convenient. So what they found is that by testing how students interact with professors in their offices, that in fact students will imitate professors. So they just set up cameras in the offices of the building they were doing the research in, and they just said that they were filming the interactions, and what they found was that students would imitate professors' body language and maybe their speech inflections a little bit, that sort of thing. And so, it'd be this sort of thing that if the professor crossed her leg, then the student might do that too. If the professor, maybe folded her arms, then the students would do that too. Not all of them, certainly. And the type of imitation we're going to be talking about really is much more subtle than the type that you would do if you were intentionally trying to imitate somebody like your sibling, like my kids used to imitate each other to bug each other, right? It's not like that. We're talking about inadvertent in the sense that people aren't consciously aware of it. And typically it's delayed a little bit. So the professor would cross her arms while she's talking, and then the student might, after say 5-10 seconds, cross their arms too. And maybe not even cross them all the way, just maybe hold them in their lap like this or something like that. It's much more subtle. But here's something interesting that was discovered, that yes, not all students did this, and none of them were aware of doing it. But the students that did it, the more that it was done, the more likely both the professor and the student would be to say that the interaction went well, that the interaction between the student and professor was successful, that they had a certain rapport with each other, that it was, that they kind of liked each other. They thought it was a good thing. And so that's kind of some early evidence that we have here, that not only does this imitation happen all the time and inadvertently, but it actually serves a purpose. And that's what we're going to be talking about mostly in this discussion of imitation. That this inadvertent imitation might have some social effects, and might actually have something even more fundamental. It might actually help us perceive each other a little bit. And we'll be talking about how the brain is involved in doing those things. Okay, let's go down to some other experiments though. And these are experiments that test something that has now come to be known as the chameleon effect. And the reason it's called the chameleon effect, and if you've ever had a pet chameleon, do people have pet chameleons anymore? They were big when I was a kid. Little lizards, easy to keep. But one of the cool things about chameleons is they change their color, their pattern, their skin pattern, depending on their context. They'll change to kind of blend in with the foliage around them. And that's the idea of a chameleon effect, in the sense that people will kind of change subtle things about their behavior depending on their context. And in this case, subtle things about their visible behavior. And we're talking mostly about facial expressions and things like that. And this is kind of another way of describing these imitative effects that we've been talking about. Here's the experiment, and this is being shown right here. Okay, imagine this is the experimenter. This is the subject. Okay. So here's. Oh shoot! No, I forgot. No, different experiment. I'm sorry. Okay, you
you're outside. Let's make it easy for you. You're out, waiting for an experiment. You're outside the laboratory, and then another student comes up and um, uh, says they're also in intro psychology, but they're in the other intro psychology class. They're not in Psych 1 and they're in Psych 2. And you're talking about the teachers and whether you're going to become psych majors or whatever. Okay. And then you go into a room, they finally let you in, and you say, okay, great, you're going to be working together. You're going to be doing a very simple task. You're going to be looking at these photographs of like street scenes or beach scenes and things like that. And your job is to describe it as well, as thoroughly, as detailed as possible, so that the other person would be able to, say, draw it in a way that would kind of look like the picture you're looking at. When they're not going to be looking at the picture, obviously. You're the one that has to describe it to them so they could then draw it. Okay? That's a cover story, right? Okay. All right. So you do this, right? You start looking at the picture, and the other person's kind of, that's what this is showing here, by the way, but it'd be two, young subjects doing this with each other. And you say, okay, I see a beach scene, and there's lots of umbrellas. Most of them are white and blue. They're kind of lined up towards the edge of the beach, right? And you can go on like this. Okay, cool. And then the other person starts, and she'll look and say, okay, I'm now looking at a street scene, and it's an intersection downtown of a city, it looks like, and there's a policeman directing traffic. There's people walking across the crosswalk, that sort of thing. Okay, but here's the cool thing. This is the sneaky part. The person you thought was a subject is not actually a real subject. They are part of the experiment. They're acting as a subject, but they're part of the experiment. Sneaky, huh? Hey, you're told all this at the end. It's no problem. People don't mind it. Sorry about the garbage trucks. Let me give it a second. Cool. So, even though they were pretending to be an intro psychology student, and talking about everything at the, we were waiting to get into the lab, they're actually an experimenter. They're a research assistant in the lab, basically, and they've been trained. They've been trained to be part of the experiment. And here comes the interesting thing. When it's their turn to describe the pictures, they're asked to do one of two behaviors. Either when they're describing the pictures, they're asked to kind of shake their foot a little bit. You know how people sometimes do that when they're, kind of fidgety. They just shake their foot a little bit when they're describing something. Or if they're in another, part of the experiment, they're asked to kind of rub their faces as they're describing the pictures. Okay, as they're describing the pictures. This person, by the way, if you're interested, they're called a Confederate, meaning they're actually pretending to be a subject, but they're actually part of the experiment. They're actually an experimenter that's kind of part of what's going on, part of the manipulation. And what they will do is they're reading the pictures, they'll shake their foot, or they'll be in another group. They're doing some face rubbing. Okay. So here I am. Okay, so yes, this one's a beach scene, and I see the umbrellas. I see people. Oh, this kid is running into the beach. There's two kids throwing a beach ball. A man and a woman are playing. What's that game with the racket and the ball? They're playing that. Okay, on and on and on. Okay. No, she's not rubbing the entire time. She'll be looking at the picture and doing this and doing that. So the question is, now when it comes time for you to describe the picture again, new picture. Okay, this one is a skiing scene out in the snow. And the question is, will you actually start doing some of the behavior she did? Okay, so now I'm seeing people on a ski lift, and it looks like there's a couple that are just finishing their run and heading into the, to the whatchamacallit, the house where all the skis are kept and everything, lodge, okay, that sort of thing. And what you see is exactly that, that the subjects, the real subjects, the naive subjects will actually imitate the foot shaking or the face rubbing unconsciously. And it happens a lot. Now, let's make sure we understand the imitation, right? It is, first of all, completely unconscious. And in these sorts of experiments, subjects are always asked at the end, did you realize when you were describing the pictures that you were rubbing your face a little bit? No. I mean, I sometimes rub my face when I'm thinking or trying to talk about something in detail. I can imagine I rub my face, but I wasn't aware of it. Okay, then you also didn't know that the other person was rubbing their face. No, that's not what the experiment was about, right? I have no idea. That's the first thing. The other thing is they'll do it in a delayed way. It will come after that person. This should be obvious. After that, the Confederate, okay, rub their face. You won't rub your face until you're starting to describe the pictures, until it's your turn to describe the pictures. But other things about it are that it will, maybe you won't be rubbing your face as much, but there will be details of that action that will be imitated. So after these researchers, after the experimenters established that this kind of unconscious imitation does happen in these settings, they decided to do other things. So they decided to, okay, have the Confederate now rub their face either quickly or slowly. And the subject would then inadvertently do the same thing, either quickly or slowly when it came time for them to describe their picture. So it's not just the action, it's the speed of the action that is also imitated in these experiments. We're going to come back to this experimental scenario in just a couple of slides where we talk about whether there's social ramifications when this type of thing happens. You'll see it'll be really interesting. But I wanted to stay on this idea of kind of certain aspects of the imitation being imitated. Because that's something that you see again and again. It's not just the person's imitating the general action. They're not just face rubbing. They're face rubbing in a way that in some ways imitates the details of the other person. It's not exact. Don't get me wrong. It's not exact, but it is. There are certain aspects, including the speed, which is imitated. Okay. Other experiments, breathing. Okay. So subjects are asked to watch a video of a person on a treadmill. Right. That's it. I think maybe they're asked, they have a kind of extra task, count the number of footsteps or, push a button at every 10 footsteps or something like that. All right. But they're also being monitored for their breathing. And there's a cover story on that. I can't remember what it is. Oh, we're going to put this little breathing apparatus on you, a little thing that measures your exhalation or something like that. Because on the second part of the experiment, we're going to ask you to walk on a treadmill or something. Okay, so there's a cover story. Because here's the thing. When people are watching somebody on a treadmill, their breathing rate will end up speeding up a little bit as they're watching the person run faster and faster. Okay, this will be an unconscious thing. And it won't match it. It's not like, by the end you're going, but you'll start breathing at a very relaxed pace when you're watching if the person's kind of just jogging at a slow pace. And if they speed up, how people, if you go to a gym, you might have seen this before. People like to, kind of go through different cycles and they'll go slowly, then they'll speed up and then they'll slow down again, that sort of thing. Your rate of breathing will subtly be changed as you're watching these speed changes happen. Again, it's not like you're panting at the same amount of at the same rate that the runner's panting at, but you'll increase your breathing just a little bit as you see them running faster. And as they slow down again, you'll slow your rate a little bit, which is interesting because you're just sitting in a seat counting the number of footsteps, or I don't know what else they have them do. It has nothing to do really with the actual task, but your breathing will be affected. What else? Eating amounts. And this is actually a very interesting kind of clinical sort of, this is an effect that has some interesting clinical implications. that people, when they go out to dinner with others, will tend to eat amounts that are dependent on what the other person, how much the other person is eating. Okay, so if you go out with somebody who's particularly hungry that day and you're both sitting down to your meal, even though you probably have ordered different things, if they're eating a lot, you have a chance that you'll be eating a lot too, versus somebody who's going out but just had actually something to eat. So they're not that hungry. So they're just going to eat part of their food or whatever. You'll eat less. So eating amounts are another thing that are inadvertently, unconsciously imitated to some degree. Now, again, all this stuff is unconscious at the end of these experiments where people are, probably videotaped during their meals or something like that, or their plates are weighed or whatever the thing is. They are asked, "Are you aware that you ate less than normally would, or that you ate an amount of your food that kind of matched your friend's amount, the amount of food they ate?" People say, no, I was just, maybe I wasn't as hungry as I thought I was or whatever. But people do it. Okay. Clinically, this is important. And this is something I know a little bit about because my wife is a clinical psychologist. She's the real psychologist in the family. And she has a private practice specializing in eating disorders. So a majority of her patients have an eating disorder. And it is very well known in that field that if you have patients, say, that are in an outpatient clinic and they are having meals together, or an inpatient clinic and having meals together, they have to be very carefully watched. They have to be very carefully monitored because, if there are multiple people with, say, anorexia that are eating together, they kind of will reinforce their small amounts of eating or whatever, and it can be a real problem. So either they'll have to be separated and say, we're going to have you guys eat separately, or eat in the cafeteria with other people who aren't struggling with this, just so this doesn't happen. It's a very well-known thing. Patients are told this sort of thing all the time. It's safer to eat with your family if they're not struggling with this than it is your friends if they have anorexia. It's a very well-known thing. One last thing I wanted to say about this sort of imitation is there's evidence that all these things, at least I should step back. Most of the imitation we see between, or that a person will do in terms of behaviors, have to be with another person, have to be with human actions. And so we're going to talk in a second about one exception to this, and you might know it. It has to do with your doggy. But for the most part, the imitations that we do, oh, hold on a second. Let me just make sure chat is up here. Yeah, the imitation we do that we've talked about, and all of these things have to do with people. Now, what I mean by that, and this is actually interesting. Sometimes it's videos that are used. For example, let's go with this one right here, which is the, oops. Yeah. Everything's working here, right? Okay, there we go. This garbage truck. This example here where you see a person running and your breathing elevates. If you were to see not a person, but a robot, okay? And sometimes you see these videos, right, where they're showing that they've designed a robot that can actually be a biped or something. And you see them on a treadmill, okay? And the robot is actually a little humanish. It actually, it's one of those kind of cutish robots that have a torso, kind of, and arms and that sort of thing. If they show the robot increasing its pace, you will not show an increase in breathing rate. That increase in breathing rate will only happen if you're watching a human. And there's other examples of these too, where they talk about kind of inadvertent imitation with a human, a video of a human versus a video of a robot, say a person reaching versus a robot reaching or something like that. And you do find that, yeah, it needs to be, in many cases, in almost all cases, a human. Okay, you're actually going to see a couple of examples of what we call trans-species imitation, but for the most part, it is human. Okay, let's talk about other examples of these now. And some of these, I think, maybe will make a lot of sense to you, that you've been imitating your whole life. And, you know, we know imitation is how children learn, how especially infants and toddlers learn, right? You know, it's a great way to learn. They look at their parents, they look at their other kids and all that, and they imitate. Sometimes it seems intentionally, other times it seems like it's kind of as unconscious as how adults do it. Excuse me. So let's talk about very early imitation. And we're talking about experiments that are looking at very young infants to see if this type of behavior might have a very early onset. And you know, typically when we're talking about these sorts of things, we're addressing, you know, nature nurture questions. Are we born with this kind of function, or is it something that takes a while to develop? And we have to be careful when, you know, we're kind of concluding something about being born with a function, because, you know, as you'll see, it's difficult to absolutely determine, but yeah, we'll see some evidence pointing in that direction. So when you were 2 weeks old, you were imitating facial expressions. 2 week old, if you know something about a 2 week old, their visual system isn't very good. By the way, this is not a 2 week old. You know, you're seeing this example here shows, I don't know, what is this, at least 6 months, maybe more like 9, 10 month old baby infant, performing the same actions she's seeing her daddy perform, that sort of thing. At 2 weeks old, it doesn't look like this. If you've been around, you know, newborn babies, you know that they don't have, first of all, they don't look like this. And secondly, they don't have that sort of kind of motor coordination really set up yet, you know. When you look at a 2 week old and they show imitative behavior, it's more like, you know, little face, and a lot of what they do kind of seems random. You know, they're kind of like just kind of looking around and making funny faces. But if they are looking at somebody that has their tongue sticking out, what they'll show is every once in a while, when they're kind of doing these weird little random motions, they'll go like that, or, you know, something like that. It's hard to actually see. You have to kind of watch them for a long time, you know, and then you have to have, you know, in the experiments, you have to have independent raters just look at the video without knowing what the parent is doing face wise, and just, you know, kind of, okay, now they're smiling a little bit, now they're sticking out their tongue, now they're opening their mouth, all that sort of stuff, right? They have to kind of watch for a while, because, you know, a lot of these actions are going to seem random. This is, you know, a very, you know, when an infant's 9, 10 months, they'll do this probably consciously and do it very clearly. With little guys, it's tiny little guys, it's harder to do that. In fact, that's much more what they look like right there. I think this is maybe a week and a half old infant you're looking at right here. And this is now a set of photos that's showing this infant actually imitating speech movements. And let's first talk about them listening to speech sounds and imitating these movements. So now the parent isn't in front of them anymore. There's nobody in front of them, except there's a little loudspeaker there. And it's playing somebody saying, ah, 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 like that over to them, over and over again to them. And you watch the infant's face, and yeah, it seems random. They stick their tongue out, they do the smile, they go, ah, all that sort of weird stuff. But then you see, you know, maybe more often than if they weren't hearing ah, they go like that a little bit, right? I mean, it's, you know, you have to watch them for a long time, and you have to kind of just have somebody independently kind of score what they're doing. But you will see more ahs in their facial expressions than if when they were hearing something different, like over and over on the going through the loudspeaker. And when that happens, they will spend more time with a closed mouth like this. And yeah, I mean, again, it will look random, but they'll show more of this type of posture with and more of this type of posture with ah. Okay. Again, it's not like they're going to imitate it immediately. You have to watch them for a while, but you do see more. And that's not only true if they're hearing those speech sounds, it's also true if there's somebody in front of them silently mouthing those speech sounds. Okay, so the loudspeaker's off now, but there's a person in front of them going like this. Okay, or like that. And they will show the same type of imitative behaviors. Again, see, this is a week and a half old, I think. Maybe they've done it even with even younger infants. It's hard to test infants. I mean, there's so much, there's so many. It's hard to, the parents want to spend tons of time with them, and it's, they're, they have so many things that they have their diapers changed all the time and all this, but these experiments suggest that we have our imitative sort of function online pretty early on. A week, it's pretty much as early as it can be tested. We're showing imitative behavior. Okay, so whether this is seen or heard, yeah, I forgot to do this. Okay, let's stick with speech for a while, because this is actually something my lab has been really interested in. So I can tell you a little bit about the history of this research, and not just my lab, but in other labs. This imitation of speech continues throughout our lifetime. And it gets more sophisticated because now not only do we do speech sounds like that, but we imitate other things when we're talking to each other. Often, most often unconsciously. We imitate each other's words. So, there's multiple words for an idea, as I'm sure you know. If somebody we're talking with uses a word to explain something, I don't know, beach or say they okay, so yeah, let's talk about the experiment where somebody is describing the beach scene, and they say, yeah, it looks like the umbrellas are just about they're almost into the sea. The people splashing around the sea and that sort of. So there's a word that's used there, sea. Okay, it might not be the most common word you would use. It's likely, though, that if the person describing that picture used the word sea, if then the other person had to describe another picture that had the ocean in it, they would use sea too. Okay, so they borrow words. We borrow words from each other unconsciously, just something that seems to happen. What else? Syntax. I'm not sure if you know that term, syntax. It's just the order of words. That's all it means. So if I said the boys are playing with the beach ball, okay, that would be one way of conveying an idea that looking at it as a picture in the picture. I also could have said the beach ball is being played with by the boys, which is the exact same idea, but I've changed the word order. One is called active voice, one is called passive voice. Even when I talk about this brings up traumatic memories from English class in high school. So I'm not going to care that you know the difference between active and passive, but do know that syntax is something that's imitated. So if somebody describes the beach ball as being played with by the boys, then that syntax, that order of words, that this is being played with by this, is going to be something that's probably going to be imitated by the other person. Oh yeah, the fruit is being sold by the vendor, not the vendor is selling the fruit. You see, I mean, don't worry about passive and active voice, but do know that word order where you're talking about the object and then who's doing something to the object is just one way of conveying the idea, but it is a syntax. It's a word order that is then imitated by the other person. What else? Simple things, rate. Okay. You might realize that I talk pretty fast, and that's partly from coming from the Northeast. We talk fast in those regions. At least I think faster than folks say in the South or Texas or maybe even in California. I don't know. But if you and I were talking and you say you were from, where do they talk slow? Texas. People talk, they talk slower in Texas. Say you're from Texas. If you and I were talking and you had a more naturally slow pace of talking than I did, we would actually imitate each other a little bit. So I would probably slow down my speaking style and you would speed up just a tiny bit. We wouldn't necessarily perfectly match each other, okay? But we kind of move towards each other a little bit. Same with intonation. All that intonation means is kind of the melody, the melody of the speech. And that's just like, you know, some people kind of talk with a high voice and they go down to a low voice like that. Some people have more of a monotone and they don't have that type of range of pitches when they speak, right? It's good. You know, in fact, I don't know if any of you guys have my audiobook, but they said, "Oh, you gotta go with the intonation there, Rosenblum. If you're going to read your own book, you can't read it monotone. You gotta, you know, talk high sometimes and talk low sometimes." And if people just have natural ways of either talking a little bit more with a melody change or talking a little bit monotone like that, it's imitated as well. If you just have a more naturally monotonic voice, I guess is the word, then I'm talking with you, I would maybe be more monotone than usual and vice versa. Maybe you'd be a little bit more pitchy than you would usually be. That's another example. And then finally, accent. And that's the one that I just mentioned where you're talking with somebody and all of a sudden you notice their accent. I'm sorry, all of a sudden you notice yourself imitating that accent inadvertently, and you're embarrassed and you feel like, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't offend the person with the accent. Okay, that happens inadvertently, as we're talking about now. Again, we're finding that you shouldn't be that embarrassed because at least that person doesn't necessarily notice it. Other people that don't have that accent will notice that you're imitating that accent, but the person whose accent you're imitating probably doesn't notice. Okay, so not only are all those things imitated to some degree when we're talking with people, but this is the thing that got me so interested in it. So do the fine grain aspects of speech. And what do I mean by that? I'm talking about the kind of ways we produce consonants, the ways we produce vowels, and the way we kind of string together our vowels and consonants. We all have different ways of doing that depending on our what region of the country we're from, our dialects, but there's also something even kind of more specific than that. You and your siblings were likely raised in the same dialect, meaning, you were raised in Southern California in Orange County, where the dialect maybe is influenced by an immigrant population of a certain type or something like that. And so you probably have very similar, if not, the same dialect. But even within that, you have ways of connecting your consonants and vowels that are just a little separate from them. Okay, a little separate from them. Unless you're identical twins, but that's a different story. Don't worry about that. But if there are any of you out there, you actually do it the same way. But let's go back to most of us that aren't identical twins. Let's talk about an example of this. Let's talk about the distinction between the syllables pa and ba. Okay. There's a technical term for you, voice onset time. I'll get there in just a second. But I think the easiest way for me to demonstrate this for you is if you put your hand out in front and go pa versus ba. Do it, kind of exaggerate it. Do a slow pa and a slow ba. Pa, ba, pa, ba. When you do pa, do you feel a little okay here? Yeah, okay. Do you feel a little breath of air when you do pa? Pa, ba. Let me tell you why you feel that breath of air. Okay. When you make a pa and ba, there's two kind of major things happening. There's a lot of stuff going on that in this that I won't talk about, but the thing I'm most concentrating on now is the relationship between what happens in the lips and what happens down here with the vocal cords. Okay. In both cases, in pa and ba, clearly your lips are opening. Very obvious. Pa, ba. Okay. And there's something else going on too. If you feel down here, pa, ba. If you were doing Tadoma, pa, ba. You can feel your vocal cords vibrating. Okay, so that certainly happens. Okay, the vocal cords vibrate, lips open. Okay, that's true of both pa and ba. But the relationship in time between when the lips open and the vocal cords start vibrating is what distinguishes pa and ba. Okay, is what distinguishes pa and ba. Okay. When you say pa, the reason you feel that puff of air coming out your mouth is because your vocal cords haven't started vibrating until after your mouth is opened. And the reason you feel that puff of air is because the air goes through your lungs, it clears the vocal cords because they're not involved yet, and comes out your mouth. So your vocal cords are not catching the air, allowing it to come out the mouth. Pa, pa, try ba again. Ba, nope, I don't feel much of a puff. Ba, ba. In ba, the air is caught by the vocal cords and starts vibrating before your lips open up. And so there's no chance for that puff of air to come out through between the lips because the vibrations are already starting down here and are catching the air that's going through. Okay, so that's the difference. Hey, I can make it even simpler for you. Make it even simpler. This down here is showing, oops, yeah, hold on, let me get this back. This down here is showing the relationship between the lips opening, lip closure, lip opening, lip opening, lip opening, and what's going on with the vocal cords. That's just called voicing here. Okay. When I make a pa, my vocal cords don't start vibrating until after I open my lips. Can you see that? Okay. There's no vibrations until nothing going on with the vocal cords here. In fact, the vocal cords, if you're interested, when they're not vibrating, they're open so the puff of air can go through. When they're vibrating, they're closed like that. There you go. Cool. Okay. So they're open. Those vocal cords are opened, not vibrating yet, not vibrating yet. The lips then open, the air goes through, and then the vocal cords start vibrating. Cool? Versus ba, where actually the vocal cords start vibrating right before the lips open and then continue afterwards. Ba, ba. Okay, I'm exaggerating now. So that puff of air, don't worry about the puff of air as a part of a component of all this. It's just a demonstration. But so you know, the puff of air can go through here when the lips part, because for pa, the vocal cord vibrations happen after the lips open up. For ba, the vocal cord vibrations happen before the lips open up. Cool. We all happy with that? That's one of you. Now you're a linguist. Now you can tell people the difference between ba and pa and what goes on in the throat when this happens. That's great. But here's the thing. When it comes to how much of a delay there is between the lips opening and the vocal cords vibrating for pa, it depends on the person. The extent of when the vocal cords start relative to when the lips part, what we call the voice onset time. It just means the voice onset time is after the lips parting for pa. It's before the lips parting for ba. One's specific extent of how much time exists between when the lips part for pa and the vocal cords start vibrating is the voice onset time, and it's different for different people. The extent of that delay between the vocal cords vibrating and the lips parting for pa is different for different people. If I am Posh Spice, okay, what's her name? I can't remember her regular name. She's married to David Beckham. I don't remember her name, but she was Posh Spice when she was in the Spice Girls. Victoria Beckham, I guess, right? You could imagine, especially if her name's Posh, she really might kind of play up that delay, right? And if you watch like any of the shows like The Crown or the old movie The Queen, or you see the royal family, there is a little bit of a they kind of wait on their um, would you like some pie, Charles? Right? There is this kind of an exaggeration, right, for posh spice, right? Um, for me and you, maybe not so much. I say posh spice, right? And I say pie. So I probably have something more like this. Posh spice has something more like this. Now, I'm using posh to kind of really exaggerate the difference. Okay. But really, when you and I talk, right, we have much less. In fact, this difference is very, very small for most of us. It's between 1/20th and 2/20ths of a second. So it's a difference of 1 to 2/20ths of a second. It's a difference of 1/20th, basically, between most of us. So again, going with Posh, let's pretend I got to know. Before I got married and before she was married, I dated Posh Spice for many years. It's a sad story. She said that she really wanted to date a soccer player, and she asked me to learn soccer, and I tried, but I failed, and so Posh Spice broke my heart. But the reason I tell you this is because when we talked with each other, me and Posh, okay, what would happen is that she would kind of decrease how much time delayed between when her lips would open and her vocal cords would start vibrating. And I kind of increase that delay. In other words, we imitate each other's extent of that delay. So imagine that. So that's how you can think about it. It's a lie. Please don't tell my wife I even brought up this story. But imagine me and Posh Spice speaking to each other, right? She's going to delay. That's her natural inclination. I'm not going to delay very much. I'll still be here. I'll still, I'll open my lips before I start vibrating here. But she's going to do it a lot more. When we talk with each other, we start coming close. We imitate that. Our brain is doing that imitation. And again, it doesn't completely match. I'm not going to be talking like Posh. She's always going to have a bigger delay than me. That's just her posh nature, right? But we'll come closer. And so that shift is even less than 1/20th. When we imitate each other, okay, that shift is 1/200th. So that's the level of kind of fine-grained imitation that I'm talking about here. It's like our brain can do this more precisely than we would ever willfully try to do it. I mean, that's the sophistication our brain is doing this with, right? I mean, certainly I can't imagine we notice it very often when we're doing this, but if at all, I mean, maybe, I imagine if I did ever talk with Posh Spice, I might be the sort of person that would start imitating her accent and then realize it. But for the most part, when we're talking with each other, since many of us don't even have the same dialect, and so we're not aware of imitating each other, we actually are to that fine grain level. It's like our brain is more precise with this than we could ever intentionally try to control. Okay, cool. Let's go on now and talk about some of the ramifications of imitation. What does imitation do for us? I mean, it's one thing to say all these imitative behaviors happen, but is there a purpose to it? Is there a reason that the brain would be spending so much energy doing this? And it's thought that there might be, because imitation might actually help you socialize, and it may, in some ways, kind of establish some sort of, kind of social, reinforce our social rule system, so we become kind to each other. We become altruistic, which is part of being the pack animals we are, right? So we herd together. We mate, for long periods of time. We spend time, unlike other, cats aren't really pack animals, right? Dogs are. We're more like dogs when it comes to this sort of thing. And what makes us pack animals are these kind of, social rules that kind of emerge out of inner interactions. And part of those social rules might be kind of engaged by this imitation that we've been talking about. So imitation does facilitate social interactions. And now here's where we're going to go back to our experiment with the Confederate, right? Here we go. There's the Confederate. Except things are going to be a little different this time. Different experiment. Same lab, probably different experiment. We're going to use a Confederate again. So you're going to be the subject. You're going to come to the experiment. I'm going to be the Confederate. And imagine I'm an undergraduate like you, but I pretend to be an intro student that's there like you are to get your experimental credit. And so we chat a little bit about what it's like being an intro student and all this sort of stuff. So you really believe I'm an intro student just like you. And then we go through the same task as the previous subjects did. It's the first time we're in the lab, so we have to be taught what the experiment is about, but we go through the same tasks. But here's how it's going to be different from before. Rather than me as the Confederate performing these different actions to see if you then imitate them, okay, I'm actually going to imitate your actions in a subtle, delayed way. So let's pretend this is you. You start describing the pictures and you say, okay, this is a downtown street scene and I see people crossing the street. There's a crossing guard there that's helping out. I see a lot of taxis, that sort of thing. And you can see what I'm doing, what you're doing as you're doing this is, I can imagine a lot of us do this when we're describing pictures, right? Just this sort of thing, kind of, I see this, I see that, that sort of thing. You're just, normal, relaxed hand gestures, something we all do, okay? When it's now my turn as the Confederate to describe a picture, I will do the same type of thing, okay? I will do it, but I will wait. I'll say, okay, I see a beach scene now, and there's this set of boys playing with a beach ball, and there's a couple playing that paddle game, lots of umbrellas, and then maybe that's it. My imitation of you will then affect how successful you believe our interaction was, which is interesting. So even though I was imitating, it kind of sounds counterintuitive, right? So, I remember when my kids were imitating each other, they would drive each other nuts. They would absolutely drive each other nuts. And that was the point, right? But here I'm suggesting that if you're being imitated in a more natural way, that's less conspicuous, that's maybe a little bit more subtle, and is delayed, okay, it's actually going to heighten your opinion of our interaction. You would say, yeah, I really like that person. I think we had a very successful interaction. Versus if I weren't imitating you, which would be another, a condition in the experiment, to be the same situation, but the Confederate wouldn't imitate the subject, right? It would be, I thought it went well, but maybe not the kind of, that was really successful, right? So it facilitates one's opinion. It improves one's opinion of not only the interaction, but of the person. Okay, what else? Well, being imitated like this and in other contexts can do the following. It actually is known to facilitate agreement between people who are trying to decide on something. And that can be shown in a set of experiments, and it can be observed, kind of out in the natural world too during meetings. The more kind of imitation you see, whether it's body language imitation or it's imitation of, say, borrowing words or the syntax, that sort of thing can actually facilitate agreement between people. It's known to increase waitress tips. So sometimes waitresses are told this, or waiters are told this, that they they might do better tip-wise if they do a tiny bit of imitation, like certainly repeating the orders. Very smart thing to do, and I imagine that kind of shows a level of competence as well as imitating, but also, kind of shaking your head along with folks probably helps as well if they're shaking their head and, kind of joking around and all that sort of stuff. If it involves some degree of the subtle imitation, it helps. It's known to increase product enjoyment. So these would be experiments where people are in a grocery store handing out samples and that sort of thing. And, after the person takes a sip of a cola or something like that, they ask how it is. And they, well, yeah, it's good. It's a little sweet. And they say, uh-huh. And if they shake their head in the same way, it's known to actually improve their rating of the product ultimately. And this is something, you can imagine has some implications, for sales and that sort of profession, right? A little imitation in the right way. Again, it has to be delayed a little bit. It has to be subtle, but it actually can facilitate things a little bit. In this case, the enjoyment of a product. This is something also that has been considered in AI situations where you're either talking with somebody, talking to a computer, or interacting with some sort of animation. That's what this is showing. And this is something that the AI folks know, that if you can get an avatar either to vocally or visually imitate the person who's interacting, the real person who's interacting with the computer, that it typically helps a little bit. And so there are systems now, there are AI systems that synthesize voices like Siri to actually try to imitate a little of the intonation of the person that the computer is interacting with. And what this system is doing here, I believe, is here's somebody interacting with an avatar, and it's actually recording their head movements and recording their facial expressions to see if applying those to the avatar, applying those to the AI avatar will improve the interaction. And yeah, I mean, early research shows that this type of thing will work. Again, I emphasize this. The imitation must be subtle. It can't be conspicuous. It can't be something that the person is necessarily noticing. It must be smooth. It can't, kind of be, you can't all of a sudden, if you're in this experiment up here, you can't raise your hand and start doing this. It has to be very natural seeming, that sort of thing. And it has to be delayed. It can't happen immediately after. It has to be delayed at least by, say 15, 20, 30 seconds. And then, it can be delayed as much as a few minutes and still be effective. So, yeah. And then finally, there's a set of experiments I think you'll find interesting. This is where the altruism component comes in, where imagine now you're in this experiment and you've been imitated a little bit, and you haven't been asked anything about the experiment. You haven't been asked. We'll have a different type of ending to this experiment. So you're not asked to evaluate the interaction. You're not asked to evaluate the person. You're just there, and you've been imitated by the Confederate, but you still don't know it's a Confederate. You'll be told after everything's over. Okay. But here's the thing that happens. All right. You are sitting in the room alone now. So the other person leaves to go. We're going to separate you now and have you fill out some paperwork. Say, okay. And you're waiting there for the paperwork to come in. And an experimenter comes in, and they're coming in with what looks like a giant pile of paperwork. And they say, oh, don't worry. No, I had to just bring all this stuff in. You don't have to fill all this out, just the top. I just had, just one of the top sheets. But they have pencils on the top as they're walking in. And I love this because we tried it out in the laboratory, and it really, really works. What they do is they pretend to slip a little bit, so the pencils all fall on the floor in front of the subject. Okay. It's amazing how good our research assistants got at this. It was really funny. And in fact, they added another component where they they said it doesn't feel natural enough to pretend to trip. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pretend we're getting a phone call on our cell phones, that it's vibrating. You say, oh, excuse me for a second. And they reach in their pockets. And as they reach in their pockets, pretending that they have to answer a call or turn off their phones, um, that's when the pencils drop. And they got so good at dropping the pencils would drop right in front of the subject, right in front of where they're sitting. And the question is, does the subject then help the experimenter pick up their pencils? And guess what? If they were imitated by this kind of subtle, delayed, smooth imitation that the Confederate was doing, they would be more likely to pick up the pencils than if they weren't imitated. And the way that's measured is how many pencils will they pick up, and they'll be more helpful if they were just imitated. There's other versions of this where people are given a little money. They're given, say, $10, and they're given two $5 bills, or no, they're given 10 singles, and they're told to go wait outside at a desk. And after they're given the 10 signals, that put on the table for them, and then they'll notice that there's a little sign there that says, please consider donating some of your subject money to the School for Disadvantaged Children, which is on campus. Please consider giving some of your money. And the question is, will they give money? And if so, how much will they give? And in fact, they will give money, and more money, if they were imitated during the experiment. So here's the altruism thing, right? That being imitated in this way, again, slow, smooth, subtle, actually helps with social facilitation. It helps us become more social. It helps us become more interactive. It helps us be, like the people that we're interacting with better, and think that the interaction is more successful, which is pretty cool. Okay, something? I am going to end here. I realize it's just a couple of minutes early. I'm going to end here so that I can make sure the video starts on the next slide for Thursday. And actually, I think I went a little slow, so I think there's going to be more to this, and then I think there might be a tiny bit more than a full 3-hour lecture's material. Might be closer to 4 hours, but that's okay. You got a lot of. I'll post it today, so you'll have plenty of time to go through everything. But it will take you through all the lecture material for the rest of the course, and then you'll hopefully be ready for your exam this weekend. Okay, any questions before I stop today about anything? Okay, everybody, well, good luck on your exam. I will be available through email if you want to contact me. Please contact the TAs first, unless it's a question for me, but they will certainly, I'm in constant contact with the TAs throughout the rest of the week. And I'll be doing this all remotely, but your grading will certainly be done by the due date. So it's probably your grades will be up by Tuesday. Okay, all right, good luck. And if I'm not in contact with you, enjoy the rest of your summer. Okay, bye-bye.